Ilana Razbash, and this is Radio Architecture.
Good evening from beautiful Bunurong country. We are broadcasting to you live on Radio Karam from unceded Eastern Kulin Nation land, down here deep in the Karam. As always, if you'd like to join the conversation, text us in the studio on 0493 213 831. My conversation partner tonight is Fooi-Ling Khoo, a registered architect and the director of OOF Architecture. Fooi loves the charms and challenges of inner city projects and copes with, maybe even enjoys, demanding heritage contexts, weird sites, eccentric clients. She specialises in one-off residential projects that are as unique as their owners and considers it a privilege to be able to work with them on their most personal and most important project, their home. Outside the office, Fooi is an enthusiastic supportive Archi team, an architects cooperative representing over 1,000 architects in Australia, is a former director and chair of its board. She enjoys teaching when she can and has taught design studios at undergrad and postgrad levels at RMIT and the University of Melbourne. Fooi is also a design film nerd and co-founded DADO, the Film Society of the Robin Boyd Foundation. She takes too many photos and maintains a strict regime of groundless optimism by supporting the St Kilda Football Club. Welcome to the program, Fooi.
Hello.
So glad to have you on. So good to have you on the program, and that's probably one of the most fun bios that I've read out in a while.
It's the football thing, isn't it?
I do occasionally get to know people's football teams and their hope, but it's really great to hear about some of the other parallel hobbies and interests that people are into, and we will no doubt touch on that later in the conversation.
Yeah, well, I think you could probably tell from that architecture is a life, not work.
It's a lifestyle. Why architecture then?
Well, I must say I actually fell into it, not say by accident, but as a kind of attrition. Where, of course, from the classic Asian family, it was always expected that I go to university, but I had no idea what I wanted to do. And so I ended up with architecture as a result of cancelling out all the courses I didn't want to do, and it was the one that seemed to be left behind. So it was, I think, lucky for me that I did fall into architecture, because I met so many fantastic people there. And also, I think it was a huge benefit to me that it was a really long course, because I don't think I was terribly grown up or directed about what I wanted to do. And architecture being terribly long and convoluted as a course actually gives you time to grow up in it, I think.
But it's also so generalised that it lets you engage with so many different things, so many interesting things in parallel.
Yeah. I mean, it is actually a great general education, the way that arts is a great general education. And, you end up using the lens of architecture to learn about the world. And I never did history. So the world history I know is via architecture. So if you can tell me the building, what era the building is from, I can have a much better understanding of, in fact, what were the world events that may have happened coincidentally at that time. Otherwise, I have very few other reference points. So really, architecture is the skeleton framework that I do understand a lot of the world through, yeah.
When you started the course, did you know that would be it?
Architecture, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, not really, because, and don't do this, kids, but I had no idea what I'd signed up for. I was really uninformed, and I don't think I really knew any architects, and I was so vague I hadn't even made the effort to try to meet one, to talk to them about what the work was. It was more, I think I was attracted by the idea of it being some sort of fusion between science and art, and I was interested in sort of both ends of those things. And there seemed to be very few other types of courses, I guess, that actually focused on that being the primary aim, is to actually fuse these things together rather than to specialise in, particular particular things. But I didn't know what it was. I mean, I've got to say, I did not know what it was. I wasn't sure what architects did. I don't think I really knew. And I didn't find out. And certainly the course itself, as you know, is not really the work either. It's actually quite different in principle. So really I went in there as a blank slate.
How long into the course did you realise? When did that moment hit?
What the hell is this?
Where did you study, by the way? Depending on the faculty, it could definitely shape the experience, that's for sure, and how big the shock factor is.
Oh, definitely. And I started at Queensland University. So when my parents migrated to Australia, we moved to Brisbane, so we were in Queensland. So I started at Queensland University and realised maybe sometime afterwards that there was such thing as the Queensland School that other people talked about. I had no idea what that was. I thought that was it. That was the way that everybody approached architecture and thought about it and discussed it. And I didn't realise that it was, in fact, distinctively different, certainly from Melbourne, I think.
What defines the Queensland School compared to Melbourne?
Well, I think there is still very much the idea that Queensland vernacular architecture, you could ask me what that means. Queensland vernacular architecture is alive, so traditional architecture that's developed over time in Queensland and in Brisbane, that is a living culture that's been continued. So the idea of innovating was actually sort of through growing that continuous tradition. And it was very much centred around the idea of, I mean, there was definitely a modernist slant to that in terms of seeing the house as a machine that you operated and in order to be comfortable. And it was maybe in a lot of ways, segued pretty well into a general idea about modernism and functionalism and, machinery, that the traditional vernacular.
I think we should describe what the Queensland vernacular looks like for our listeners, or what is a Queenslander house?
Well, a Queenslander house is a very beautiful thing. And for those of you that may have visited Brisbane before and in some of the older suburbs, you will probably remember that quite a lot of those inner suburbs are actually really hilly, beautiful suburbs. And a lot of them have these beautiful, quite delicate timber structures for these houses, which are often elevated on stilts and with a beautiful wide veranda that wraps all the way around. And with lots of beautiful timber trellis work and
sometimes
quite often
a sleeping room.
Yes, and that is one of the great things about the under the house where the stilts are, or the verandas. These become places that expand or contract depending on how big the family is, how the house is being used, whether there's been a flood, whether it's raining, whether it's hot. All those things are adjustable, expandable bits of a house, in fact, that can't happen where, I guess in the sort of traditional architecture that you see in Melbourne, where it's very hard and fast. What's inside, what's outside, end of story. It's a much more black and white relationship. And one of the fantastic things about these Queenslander houses is these in-between spaces, which has been written about quite a lot as being one of the really distinctive things of living in, I guess it was sort of like subtropic, semi-tropical kind of areas, and which is where that architecture originally came from. Yeah.
To cope with the heat and to cope with the flooding.
And the humidity.
The
humidity is one of the biggest things, because there's not much that relieves that, in the days before air conditioning, other than air. So if you're elevated above the ground and sitting on the right side of the hill, sitting on the veranda in the evening, watching the sunset and feeling the breezes come in is actually one of the most beautiful things in Brisbane. So anyone who visits, please take the opportunity to, Airbnb if you can, a Queenslander, because it is a very distinctive, beautiful experience of the climate in Brisbane.
It sounds like such a no-brainer to engage and build for the climate where you are.
Rad, hey?
And yet down here, in some conversations, it is a radical suggestion.
Yes, I think it is, and it's. I think for a long time I thought, certainly when I first came to Melbourne, I feel like it was considered a very daggy idea, like super daggy, and partly it's out of. It was considered not intellectually interesting or not intellectually sophisticated to merely cater or acknowledge the climate.
That gives me pause. That really just gives me pause as a premise because you're shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, I know, it's a real duh. But there was, I think, certainly when I first came to Melbourne, it was very much a high theory phase, shall we say, of architectural interest. So people were very, very, and when I finished uni as well as sort of in this period, that people were very, very interested in, do you remember, deconstruction?
Yeah.
Oh, dear God. I tried so hard to get into it because it was considered so cool. So the European, cultural theory, all this sort of stuff, which was, I guess it was exotic and it was sort of exciting coming from Brisbane, certainly, especially when you come through architecture where it was so much more hands-on and practical and sort of day-to-day and immediate, like climate. The idea of actually generating architecture from these purely theoretical basis seemed like a good idea at the time. But, I don't think I didn't last with that for very long.
Just to contextualise it for some of our listeners, what decade was this all happening in?
Let's just say sort of like through the 90s.
Through the 90s.
I
So
think.
the halftime club was
And
still
the
going.
80s as well, sort of before that, but like the 90s was when I would have experienced it. Yeah, so halftime club, there was a lot of that going on, and a lot of architectural drawing that was undecipherable, and the more it was impossible to read, it meant the cooler your project was. So there was many, many, many beautiful, beautiful drawings that were just impossible to read because they were generated in such a way as to be artworks in themselves. So the actual drawings were not construction. They were not for a builder to build from, but they were actually products in themselves. And they were maybe some of the most interesting part, I think, of a lot of that work. I don't know how many of the buildings really stand up.
I'd definitely say that about Zaha Hadid's 80s thesis paintings.
Those paintings are so beautiful. They're really beautiful. And her buildings?
In the eye of the beholder. for everyone's own taste.
I haven't seen many of them, but I did see Maxi, the 20th Century Gallery in Rome once. And disappointment, I've got to say.
Didn't do it for you?
No, that's... It certainly highlighted to me like that lack of connection between the materials and the reality of building and also the context, of the city, the actual neighbourhood that was built in, the scale of the neighbourhood, the relationship of like basically the building to actual reality. It's not there.
Yeah, it looks like it just landed.
Yeah, and a lot of the construction also looks a bit shifty in that it could never be as perfect as a computer rendering, because a real person has to make it, and that engagement wasn't there with the real person that has to make it. So as a result, you kind of go, look at those curves that are always less than perfect, that bit of lumpy render, and it's like, nah.
It's interesting to contextualise this moment, moving from Queensland out of experiencing living amongst or being part of the Queensland school, coming to Melbourne, where it was almost the height of this, yet the beginning of the crisis of relevance in architecture, but also the height in trying to grapple with what does an Australian architecture mean and what does it mean to be architects in Australia and not just a tin shed that touches the ground lightly. And you can see how in that moment they're rejecting the Queenslander house, saying this isn't us, this isn't Australian architecture, this isn't good enough. And now we are returning back to the moment where no, we want cross ventilation, we want to respect that history and that heritage and the culture and the living tradition of practice.
Yeah, I think it's one of the really interesting things I did come across in Melbourne when I first came here was the as opposed to the Queenslander, there was a local vernacular architecture or architecture that grew out of Melbourne, which is suburban Melbourne architecture. And so it was Edmund and Corrigan that was actually doing that work, but in a different way. What they were interested in was definitely like the history and the tradition of that in Melbourne and linking into that. But their idea was, I guess, engaging it in a more postmodern way. So it was about the symbols that, collected on suburban houses, about the idea of houseness and, what was the real Australian home, and extracting that kind of language and then continuing to develop that language and sort of making new work with it. And that was really interesting. So there were people here working on a living tradition as they saw it, but it was, yes, quite different in terms of it still being abstract in a certain sense because it was about the symbolism of suburbia rather than the actual houses themselves. Because the the old brick venereal, it has issues, but also it's incredibly practical. And I think there are a lot of things like that maybe we are making more time for now. When we're actually more accepting, I think, of those sorts of traditions, and probably people love suburban houses now much more than they ever used to. It used to be considered so daggy. It was the thing you ran away from. We all ran away from our suburban childhoods to go somewhere more sophisticated, and more interesting and more European in a lot of cases. And the, I guess, acknowledgement and sort of love for our suburban past is something that people have come back to, I think.
I'd like to remind listeners that if they want to experience a bit of this architectural history and see some Edmund and Corrigan work for themselves, they can just drive up the Edithvale Road, not far from where we're broadcasting here tonight, and go see the Keysborough Church of the Resurrection. Really one of their masterpiece buildings. And
I just hadn't, if only I'd done my research properly, I would have spent the whole day, making my day down here in order to visit these various sacred sites, because that would be fantastic to see.
The bucket list, but before sound check, you were telling me you did check out the Robert Simeone Life Saving Club
Which
in
was
Seaford.
Great, yeah. And I didn't have a chance to, check out some of the other life saving clubs that I passed down, but I reckon that would be actually a great weekend tour. Take a day, nice long drive down to the beach and then drop in at all of those life-saving clubs and then, yes, cap it off with the Keysborough Church. That would be a lovely architectural sort of epic tour.
Or a bike ride for those that are particularly keen. Well, I actually have a question that I like to ask all my guests at the beginning of conversation. We've taken quite a journey.
It took a while to get here.
We took a while to get here, but I love hearing the beginnings of those architectural foundations for you and those moments. But I want to go back to the very, very beginning and ask, what's your earliest memory of a building or place?
Let me see. A childhood memory would be, I was born in Malaysia, and being actually the actual tropics, like pretty much on the equator, it was always very hot and sticky. And one of the things I loved the most was rolling around on the tiled floor. So every house floor was, a suburban house floor was tiled. And not tiled as in really floor tiles. I think they were really bathroom tiles, but I love those. They're beautiful colours and beautiful textures and just sort of like rolling around on that. Yeah, that was great.
What colour were those tiles?
Oh, I'm sure there was aqua blue with sort of flecks. I do remember that, and the flecks were a little bit textured. And there was quite an ornate sort of tessellated pattern, I do recall, and I love those. And in terms of buildings, I think, some things I've actually realised were fantastic in retrospect. I didn't realise they were interesting places, and I think it was through an architectural education that once I actually started uni and thinking and learning a lot more of architecture that I remembered you kind of review your own sort of visual history and experience, and you realise some things that you were in were actually amazing. I was just thinking, one of the when I was at high school, when I was at secondary school, one of the fantastic buildings there was a chapel by Carl Langer, who is a fantastic modernist architect who lived in Brisbane. I think it was built in the 70s sometime. I never knew it was interesting. I only thought it was dreary that we had to go to chapel every morning because I was in this school. It was much more religious than my parents realised, because my parents we're not Christian. But I was sent to a Lutheran college. It was quite weird. And we were made to go to chapel every morning, so that was a total drag. But I do recall now that the actual chapel that we went to was a Karl Langer chapel, and it was really beautiful. It was a fantastic building. And I actually think of it much more now than I did at the time, and realise what a chance it was to actually experience a place like that. Yeah.
Can you describe some of those moments that made it beautiful or special?
Yeah, well, it was it's quite a plain building, but very modern in that it had an essence of churchness about them without really having any of the literal language of a church, except, the cross, of course. But the ceiling and the wall actually sort of swooped down and behind the altar. And you didn't see any windows as you came into the building, because the walls were the walls were made up of series of blades that sort of pointed towards the altar. So the light came in and fell on this beautiful sort of sweeping curve from the ceiling to the wall, but you never actually you couldn't see out, you couldn't see the buildings. So the focus was always this beautiful soft light on behind the altar and behind the cross. And it's really such a fantastic space, and very, very, very simple. It was for a school, so it was pretty rugged to deal with all the school kids rampaging in and out, but, very beautiful.
Did a lot with a little.
Yes, and that was a huge lesson, I think, that luxury isn't really that interesting. It's not actually the materials, it's the big idea.
It's the space, it's the light, it's the air, it's the volume.
It's all the things that I think make architecture really one of the last things, I guess, where the experience of it, like the real life sort of on the ground experience of it, is really the only way that you can understand it, because those things are pretty much impossible to capture on any other medium. Yes, you can look at photographs, you can look at videos, you can look at all these things and learn a lot. And the drawings, of course, that document buildings, you can learn a lot from there, but they're all just pointing towards, maybe each of them are sort of like, 15%, 10%, 20%, of of the idea of what this is. And it's really being there is the only way of actually experiencing that. And it's, I think in a digital sort of internet sort of access, where everything seems so accessible, some things are still so fundamental, so physical, that your person must be there. There is no other equivalent.
It's the same as when you travel, right? And you study a building in a book, and until you actually get there and feel it and participate in it and learn the lessons that you have to in person.
Yes. Oh, it's amazing. And very often, things that you've looked at a million times, you turn up there and it's not at all like that. And in some ways it is, but you realise that was just such a small piece of like what the place is. It is actually remarkable, and it's a great reminder actually of the work that we are doing. It is space, it's not stuff. Yes, of course you need stuff to make space, but essentially it's the space, and you can't communicate that really any other way than being there physically.
It's so hard to capture it in a photo in a way that's honest.
Yes.
You can jazz up a photo.
Highly manipulated.
Of smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, I know. Bit of zoom adjustment.
Exactly, a clever pot plan in the right spot for anyone who's been on site in those moments. Well, I want to pivot to talk about your work because it's actually very exciting for me to be able to discuss residential architecture specifically, and I think our listeners will be quite interested in that as well.
I'm so happy you're interested in that.
Where we cover many, many topics of radio architecture, cover really broad terrain, but I think it's really important to unpack what makes a great family home and why this work's so meaningful and interesting for you. So I want to ask, have you always been interested in residential?
Yes and no. I mean, I think, yes, of course, because every human being, I think, is interested in their house, like is interested in home. It is, so fundamental to us to actually have a home that you love, I think. And but then I think maybe I sort of segued away from that through my architectural education because it's, there are of course many other more important of forms, and by more important I'm meaning maybe in a civic sense, than a single family house. And so that idea of sort of bigger community facilities, work for government, for schools, the much bigger picture things, and of course much, much more expensive things like, an airport and huge urban design projects, things like that, tend to sort of take over when you're, I think, during an architectural education, and a house is left far behind as being in a lot of ways, I think maybe too easy, because those aren't the sort of projects that you get when you're doing design projects. They don't ask you to design a single family house. It's extremely rare for that to happen, I think. And so it's in a way, it's like the long journey sort of back to the house is by actually working. And I think I was lucky enough to work for different practices before I started my own practice that always designed houses. And they may have also designed, much bigger housing things like multiple housing things, projects, high density projects, medium density, all sorts of things. But a single family house was still something they also did as well. And you could see the sort of care and the sort of engagement that sort of went into a single family house that doesn't exist in every other project. And I think that's largely because the client is the person that lives in the house. And this is something maybe that people who don't work in architecture don't realise, is that we do so many projects where the client is not the person that actually uses the building. It's a very common thing just because of the way, especially larger projects, have to be organised. You're not going to ask every single person, every single doctor and every single nurse in a hospital what is it that they're looking for and what they regard as the perfect hospital, because they can't. So it'll go through the board that meets with the other board that then reports to the board that then sort of all the way down to sort of to meet with the architect. So something like a house is where you really sit down with a person one-to-one to actually talk about what is it that they want from their home. And it's rare to have that really intense sort of singular kind of relationship that you have with people for work. It's great.
And that's important to mention. It's an intense relationship that goes for a number of years.
Yes.
Potentially more recurring.
It's always longer than they think.
It's always longer than they think. Hopefully recurring. You always wish for more work, especially when it's been successful. But what people are actually buying from you is your time. Yeah. It's 2 to 3 to 4 years of your life, of care, of attention, of relationships, of conversations.
Yes. Absolutely, and it's it's not reflected in the number of drawings, I guess. So it's quite, in some ways, it's an ethereal relationship, because you're not going to get drawings by the kilo that's worth, X amount of money. What you will have is thinking, and engagement with that project. So people, certainly don't realise, and how much time goes into these things. And quite often I think clients are really surprised by how long things take and how much detail that is actually required to resolve a building, and how much engagement they need to have with it as well. That there's actually quite a lot of work they have to do as part of the process. And, you know, when it goes well, it's fantastic. You know, you can have, you know, lifelong friends from, you know, building these relationships with people.
What's been one of your favourite moments over the years?
There's been quite a few with these sorts of projects. I think there actually are a lot with residential projects because, you know, when someone actually moves into the house, they are actually also seeing the realisation of their ideas. So it's not a remote thing where everyone turns up for opening day and a politician comes along to make an announcement and cut the ribbon and woohoo, you know, get some photos and off we go. It's actually someone that moves into their home, you know, and you know, quite often maybe it's a week later, a month later, you know, you'll get sort of a dribble of messages from people going, oh, I've just realised, you know, when I open the door to the bathroom and I look out the window and I see this, and then the way the light comes in the afternoons sort of like through the kitchen into my study, I love that. These sorts of things are really exciting to get, and they are really such lovely things because they are hopefully things that you've built into the project all the way along. And you've probably told your client, you know, in your client meetings, you've gone through with people and tried to describe in detail what all these things are. And I think most people go, oh, yeah, wow, rhubarb, information overload. Yeah, that all sounds good. Yeah, let's do it. And it's not until
they feel it.
Yeah, until they're there, and then they realise the repercussions of all these decisions. So that's great, and that's, I think, most projects are like that, which is why residential is like so great, because you get that immediate instant feedback, just like you get instant feedback when they don't like something. You know, it's actually pretty in your face, which is the way I'd prefer it to be.
It might be quite refreshing in the slow, long game that is architecture and the years and years.
It's so slow. It is very slow, actually. You cannot be an impatient architect, I think.
That's very true. Is there something you wish more clients, more people, more families seeking to build their family home, their dream home, their forever home knew before getting in touch?
There are, well, I think mostly it's not so much about the process itself, but about realising how much you can do, that it's not something that you just pick out of a magazine like you're sort of shopping for bits and pieces. It's the potential of what you can do with your home as a reflection of the way that you want to live is, you know, enormous. There's a huge range of stuff, and I think sometimes people are limited by what they can see in a magazine.
Or on Pinterest.
Yeah, or on Pinterest or Instagram, or, you know, what is it? You know, any of these terrible sort of TV makeover, horrible makeover shows, that they are limited by what that kind of media wants to you know, cover. And it's a lot wider than that. So the things like, you know, whenever there's an open house programs, whether it's the Robin Boyd Foundation, or I think the Institute also still quite often still runs a awards open day, or Open House Melbourne, of course, all these sorts of things. If people get the chance to go and visit houses, like, just grab it, because they're private houses. So, of course, you're not going to be able to visit it any other time. It's going to be one of these one-off things. And that's a great way of actually just seeing, like, this, you know, get some little inkling of that huge variety of ways that people have actually made their homes. And it's, you know, sometimes quite far from what any conventional house might be. And it's very, you know, incredible how limited you can be by the house that you live in, like, because it limits the way that you live. So if you see a house that's actually different, you realise you can live differently.
Limits the way that you think as well. There's so much behavioural and environmental psychology that goes into architecture.
Yes, absolutely. And you can see that in the way the spaces are set up, how they relate to each other, what's open, what's closed, what's considered private, what's considered public, all these sorts of things are all little pointers. They're where the building's telling you how you're supposed to behave in different spaces. And that reflects, of course, cultural things like, whether it's current fashion or whether they're traditional ideas about how people are supposed to behave, how people are supposed to socialise. What's a relationship between parents and kids? What's that supposed to be like? What's a relationship between, a couple in a house? And, say in a traditional house where there was like the household duties that was done by the woman and, the man of the house was working outside the home, there are the way the spaces are set up, reflect that kind of structure. And so while it doesn't, it's not going to dictate people doing those things if that's not what you do, but the house will probably get in your way. You'll have to find the workaround, which is something, you can throw out the window and start all over again in a lot of ways when you do a custom design on your home, because it can be the way you actually want to live. And I was just at the Robin Boyd Foundation the other day at the Walsh Street House, so which is a fantastic house, and I've been there many times. But every time I go there, I discover new things, and I love the way that it's organised because you can actually see there was a different idea they had about how a family lived together there. And I think most people are quite astounded to learn that the main entry actually comes straight into the parents' bedroom. You know that, of course.
Yes, but I forget it all the time.
So you come straight into the main bedroom, and it looks like it's a little sitting area, like a lounge area, but in fact it is which was used as most of the time because Robin and Patricia Boyd were huge entertainers. Like they were always having parties, always having people around, and so it's a party house. But at the same time, it's also a family home, and the kids have their own space down the other side of the courtyard. So it's
on the opposite end of the garden.
The grown-up zone and the kids zone are actually separated by a courtyard, but there's always a visual relationship, so the parents could always tell if someone was being set on fire, if something bad was happening down there, but they could party on without that kind of clash of the household. So there's a lot of things like that which I think you can't tell until you go to places. Yeah. So visiting houses is massively important. Yeah.
And I think it's funny that it's so easy to forget also that's how it was designed, particularly the Robin Boyd's house, because it's such an event venue. And it's still constantly hosting, still constantly busy. There's so much happening, and those memories start fusing. And what does that home mean? What does it mean to be in that place?
Well, it probably is some pointer to the way that it was designed, why it's so easy to actually use it as a venue, because it's a fantastic venue. I think you mentioned before, like we used to run film nights there, and it's like, well, yeah, we could do that. We could have a bar, we can have entertainment. You can have all sorts of things there. It just like sits in that house so well. Yeah.
What's your favourite movie?
Oh, that's like, there's so many. But my favourite Daggy movie that I have seen many times is Galaxy Quest. Do you know that one?
No.
For all the sci-fi nerds out there, all the kids that grew up watching, who grew up loving pretty terrible science fiction series, whether it's Doctor Who or Star Trek or anything in between, this movie is for you. It is starring Tim Allen. Do you remember Tim the Tool Man? There was a show that he popular sort of American comedian, and he's the star of this show. He's the main character, who is an actor in the movie, who works on a science fiction series. And Sigourney Weaver is one of the crew that's on this on this show with him, and Alan Rickman as well. So it's a fantastic cast, and it's a brilliant. Well, it starts off being a satire about sort of science fiction nerds, but really, I think the way it ends, it's trying to tell us that it's actually all true, that it's not really make-believe, that we can hang on to the dream, that all those things, those TV series are actually real.
That's your optimism coming through, your groundless optimism.
You can save the world on a spaceship. You can.
I think you do have to be an optimist as an architect. That's very true. Well, I have the same first question or early question for all my guests. Do you find yourself coming back to a particular question when you're about to start working with a new client?
Yes, I think it is. It's always a question. Well, part of the skills that I think we're supposed to have, and I think I feel like I have honed that in work, which you can't do at university. It can only be done in the office or on the job, is talking to people and trying to get them to tell you what they really think. It's not an easy thing to ask people what they want from their home. I mean, to ask people what they want, full stop, really, because most of the time I think people are more used to saying what they don't want. So people find it generally much easier to talk about the things that they hate.
That's so true.
And whereas when you go, what do you want? It is such a huge question. It is difficult, yeah. And so every time I start a job, I guess it's a bit of an adventure. It is fun because it's when you start really talking to someone and try to, through all the subsequent meetings, sort of peel away the layers to find what someone really wants, as opposed to what they think other people want, as opposed to what they think they should want. All these sorts of things.
And what they think they want.
And what they think they want. And it's quite a complex thing trying to peel those things back, because there are a lot of expectations and pressures, I think, on people about what the home reflects about you, because it is people do see it that way. They see it as a sort of little window into your soul. And so how you want to present yourself, what's important to you, all these are sort of wrapped up in there. And sometimes a lot of those things, they get in the way of how you want to present yourself is not actually how you want to live. And it takes a bit of disentangling. Sometimes it takes quite a bit of therapy to actually work through these things. And then certainly if you're working with couples, which you often do for designing a home, there's a bit of, couples therapy that you might have to do.
Really generalised here as a profession. We very much are generalists.
Got to cover everything. But that's also part of communication skills. I think that really is one of the biggest thing, is just talking to people. And you do have to like people. And I do find that if you don't respect your client, it's not going to be good. So it'll never be a good outcome. So that idea of finding the right sort of work for you, I think is really, it is a really important aspect of making good work.
And also for clients, future prospective clients, for people thinking about their next home who are listening tonight, it's finding the right architect for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes clients feel a bit anxious or sheepish about admitting, we've talked to another architect as well. And I always say, great, that's fantastic. You should definitely do that. Sometimes people talk to 5 architects and before they find someone that suits them. And that's great, because you really need to find someone who you feel is on the same planet, that you can build a good relationship with, that there is some sort of magic, some sort of chemistry where you feel like you could really sit down and talk about what you really think. Someone that you don't have to perform for, that someone that you can feel like you could be friends in a way. not in a creepy way. You don't have to be friends with, don't have to be friends with your architect. But if you want to make them dinner and stuff, that's really cool too. But definitely it's that feeling of communication and trust, really. So if you can't feel that when even in an initial meeting, it's not going to go well for the next few years, and especially where there's going to be a lot of stress, like financial stress, because these are, with residential projects, I think one of the big things is these are people's life savings, and so this is what you're working with, and you have to be, cognizant of just the massiveness of this kind of project in people's lives. It's their life savings. This is it. There's not going to be another one. This is it. And so getting that right as much as you possibly can, and also for people to find the right person to work with, to sort of work on that together with, is a huge thing, because it's much more of a collaboration than people realise, I think.
Mm. That trust is so huge and so important to emphasise.
Yeah. Because if you don't trust someone on the first day, oh my God, it's downhill.
You're never going to tell them how you want them to design your bathroom, that's for sure. Yeah. You're never going to share the intimate moments.
Yeah, and you're always going, well, anyway, the budget's $500, but actually you've got, $5,000 or something like that. That doesn't go well either, because financially it's also one of the biggest things we have to deal with. It's having all those honest, open discussions about how much money things worth. I'll not say things worth, but how much money, what you're hoping to achieve might cost, what you might have to do to bring it back under budget. All those sorts of things have to be. So it's a very warts and all kind of thing. So it's your dreams as well as your wallet.
Very, very important, very serious decisions, but very rewarding decisions. What are some of the greatest joys or wins that you'd love people to know about when you really get a great design outcome and people love their home? And what's that like?
It's fantastic, because it really is something that you feel like you've made a real difference to that person's life, or those people's lives, a family, because a home is where they take off and do everything else in their lives. So you feel like if you've actually provided the nest, the stage, whatever you want to call it, for them to be able to live their lives, and it is a sort of I feel like it's a contribution to how much they could then do with the rest of their lives if that was it's such a great place where they could be.
Springboard from. It's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that housing the home and having that stability is fundamental.
Yeah, I think it's fundamental in terms of the basic everyday sort of things of safety, security, or confidence, these sorts of things. But also I think people learn about the poetic nature of the world sort of through their homes as well. So whether it's a relationship with the garden, with the sky, with the sun, with the light, with the seasons, whatever it is, the way that you sort of engage with these things is also very much part of a home. And as we sort of started off in the earlier conversation, when you talk about your childhood memories, like what are they? They'll be of your home and the life of the home. So it really is so fundamental that being able to work on that stuff with people is, you feel like you're genuinely contributing. I hope I'm not overstating this, but to to people's lives, in a very direct way. That we don't just provide the facility for them to live; it does that as well. But actually, it is the place where you sort of dream, create, find the confidence to go out in the world. I think it's a massive thing.
Mm. You had a feeling of this and a sense of this because as you were training before starting your own practice, you did have residential experience and you worked in firms that also did residential work.
Yes. Yeah, there was, I think I worked on a lot of different types of housing. So, so from, high-rise towers to, for developers to, housing for government. Not so much public housing, but sort of maybe medium densities or public housing-ish kind of things. So public-private as well as sort of individual houses, and you could see the idea of a home is maybe one of the few consistent things that I've done all the way through my work. Even though I've worked on a lot of other different sorts of projects, like freeways and things like that, which is also pretty cool. But it revolves around housing of all different levels and all different sorts, and it's a great picture into the entire world, like how people want to live. And also how people want to sell you places to live, so it's like the whole structure of the economy as well as sort of like the culture of housing that you see sort of by working in these things.
Have you had to pivot your own practice or observed a pivot in the procurement models? Are you still going through an invited tender?
I've got to say I really hate a tender, or a too broad one, certainly. The in recent years, I think everyone's seen in the media the volatility of construction costs, which is of course about the scarcity of labour, or the supply of materials has sort of become quite erratic through COVID, and a lot of that stuff's still being disentangled, and some of those changes probably will never, sadly. Prices never go down, do they? They only go up. So the deceleration might happen in terms of prices not accelerating as fast, but it never really goes back. And because of all those sorts of factors I'm really finding that what I prefer to do is just work with builders that I think are really good and reliable, and that there's been various different projects that you might have done together. So there's actually a history of work and also a history of follow-up, I've got to say, where if something does go wrong, will the builder come back and fix it? How do they see their role in terms of someone who, of building someone's home? When the contract's finished, is it finished in their heads, or is it actually, there's some sort of pride in in what you've actually made, so that there's a sense of responsibility to people about making these projects, and that sort of stuff. It takes a really long time to figure out, about builders. So, I would not say just builders, but anyone that you work with, it takes a long time to figure out whether their personality, their nature, their sense of pride in their work, all these sorts of things. It takes a long time to work those things out. So if you are able to, I think working with people that you have that a lifetime of work type trust in is actually a great way of making buildings together. And it means for a client that they with, I guess what I'm referring to is early contractor involvement, also known as ECI for people in the industry.
For the procurement nerds out there.
That to start talking to builders very early in the process. So maybe you might talk to just a small number of builders anyway. It might only be a couple or something like that, maybe 3, with very early sketches, and then pretty much get them on board and work with them as part of the team, so that by the time you come to building the project, they've already been on board for like months, if not a year or something like that. And the client also then has an opportunity to meet them, to work with them, before construction even starts. So because you'll be working on, there are plenty of things to work on before construction starts with a builder, like the pricing, for example, which is a huge thing. Being able to work on the cost of a building as part of the project. So if it's too much, how do you pull it back? What are there'll be discussions about different different materials, different types of construction, different approaches to whether it's footings or things like that can be tremendously helpful, and also pull the budget back in certain regards. So being able to discuss on it and work on the budget, just like you might work on any other aspect of the design, is a crucial thing to being able to complete the building in a way that the client can afford, because you know that.
It's sometimes also the only way the client might be able to still get that dream home and get that idea is by working with an architect that has a good team. But if you're working with a QS or by the CCI model and you've got a builder that you trust and you want to move forward with. Because if you just went to a spec builder, here's the price, the price is the price. That's it.
Yeah, and then like, who are they? Do they understand the sort of work that's required? Because some things are obviously on drawings. I mean, literally the construction drawings, they're the instructions for making the building. But there's a whole lot of stuff around that about how you relate to the client, most of all, I think, which is really important. So how you communicate with them, will they trust you? Do you not understand that they need to trust you? Likewise, from the builder's perspective as well, they need to know that the client is actually solid, that they're trustworthy people. Because I understand that from the builder's point of view, it's also a huge risk for them. I mean, I think a lot of people will have seen in the media in the last year or so, couple of years, the number of builders that have gone under, it is absolutely shocking. It is really quite distressing because it cuts right across the whole industry, from massive builders to really small boutique builders. They haven't gone under because they're running bad practices necessarily, or anything that's even necessarily their fault. But there's a whole lot of circumstances that have conspired since COVID to actually push people right to the brink. Maybe they used up all their fat in the business, dealing with COVID things, and then it just takes one more thing to just tip them over. But we've lost a lot of great people out of the industry because of that. And so that, I do understand that there's a risk on both sides. And I think for the contract nerds now, if we switch to that, building contract nerds, anyone that's actually looked at those, and really any contract, it's about the distribution of risk and the sharing of risk, because that is what building is. Both parties have to actually put in massively, financially, put themselves on the line in order to get a thing built. So this is also part of, I think, architecture, which I know it sort of sounds a bit nerdy sort of down one end, but it's also part of what's really exciting about making buildings, because they are such big projects, resource-wise, financially-wise, time-wise, that they are monuments, of bigger or smaller sorts, really, all of them.
I'm mindful of the time now. I'll ask my last question. What is it that gives you hope?
Hope. Well, as mentioned by that football thing, I can find hope in nowhere. I think there's always hope. Even when you look at disastrous situations, like if we just bring up sort of some US politics for a moment, how bad were things looking? Maybe a month ago? Oh no, not even a month ago. 2 weeks ago? So right before Biden stepped down, 3 weeks ago maybe. You think about when you recall just what the atmosphere was like in the United States before that happened and what has happened since. It's actually quite remarkable how things can turn around with an attitudinal change. The will, and this is maybe in some ways leaving aside even whether you're conservative or you're progressive, it's actually the will to make change and be positive. Like, people changed completely in terms of their attitude to the election in the United States just because of that change of leadership. And it's remarkable what people can do when you just change your mind, I think. And you can see that in a lot of different things. And we can see it here as well when finally, with the change government, we're actually acknowledging that climate change exists. Most people seem to be able to acknowledge that. Some people still are not able to acknowledge that. But the fact that most people do is actually changed the doom and gloom into thinking about what are we going to do about it, and then the sorts of ideas that come up. And whether you're talking about, it's not just a technological innovation, it is actually an intellectual, cultural innovation that needs to happen in order for us to change. And that you can see that everywhere. And I think it's remarkable how quickly, these things can happen when, in fact, you just decide that you will. It's remarkable. I mean, it's actually amazing, like the sorts of programs, even now after a relatively short time, after a decade and a half?
It's a blimp in human history.
Yeah, of going around in circles. Suddenly we've decided it's a problem, and it's a problem we're going to address, and it's actually remarkable in such a short time how much is being done. Obviously, there's a hell of a lot more to deal with, but the fact that we are actually engaging with the problem is fantastic. Yeah. And I think it's talking to people and meeting people is, part of that hope, I think, that I often find just seeing what people are doing, seeing how, how enterprising and creative and enthusiastic people are for things always gives me hope for things, because that's all it takes is to decide to do it.
Where there's a will, there's a way.
Yep.
Thank you so much for joining me on the program, Fooi.
Thanks, Ilana.
Thanks for joining me for another evening of Radio Architecture with Ilana Razbash. This live show was broadcast and recorded in the Radio Karim studio on Bunurong Country. You can replay this show wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in and supporting community radio. Take care.
Hey, I'm Jane Oakley, a Matilda alumni footballer, number 36, and you're listening to Radio Karim. Stay tuned.